Good afternoon and greetings from Cape Town and from us at the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation. Welcome to all in South Africa and globally, and thank you very, very much for joining us today. Today's anticipated courageous conversation, titled Ecological Apartheid, Good Food for All, will explore the concept of ecological apartheid and how the long-term effects of South Africa's apartheid policies in the post-apartheid dispensation continue to scar the land and its people. Today's dialogue also forms part of the Foundation's Courageous Conversations series of public dialogues on difficult, topical issues that aim to activate the courage required to heal our societies from the myriad inequalities that we are all experiencing in South Africa and globally within the context of COVID-19. And of course, within broader systemic inequities before COVID-19. So this conversation also comes to us at a particularly fitting time for two reasons. Firstly, because it intersects seamlessly with the strategic theme that our foundation has recently adopted, which is the courage to heal. These are two words I've heard frequently. If one did a discourse analysis of all the critiques over the last year, but particularly over the last month, the words courage and heal are constant in the discourse. And secondly, because the conversation is framed to interrogate the vital interdependence of people and land, modes and models of agricultural production, and the roots of dispossession, amongst other issues. And I want to share, and Archbishop Tutu is on record as saying, and I quote, "People do not go hungry because there's not enough food to eat. They go hungry because a system which delivers food from the fields to the plate is broken." End of quote. Today's timeless deliberation also occurs in the aftermath of South Africa's cathartic and what many have termed as an existentialist crisis. Food for all, hunger, basic social and human rights, health for all, vaccines for all, unemployment, poverty, racism, insecurity, deep despair, all starkly exposed, and for all to see and for all to change. In conceptualizing and planning today's provocative dialogue, and we do hope it will be provocative, in planning this with our fellow panelists, a key question is, given that we are one humanity on one planet, how can we forge unity in diversity and ecological justice? Overcome ecological apartheid to ensure no one is hungry and that no one is deprived of access to resources vital for life and livelihood. The Foundation's call to action through this conversation is to bring to the surface what needs to be faced to dismantle ecological apartheid and to identify how we might exercise our individual and collective agency to bridge the gulf between humans and nature and to ensure everyone has access to nutritious food. So collectively and in dialogue, we hope to explore and learn about how the monopolization of seeds has had devastating effects on farmers in developing countries. How did we get here? And thank you for joining us, Dr. Vandana Shiva. We're very privileged to have you here today and to hear from you on this vital theme. What is the impact of seed monopolization on the global south? What are the underlying power dynamics that would need to be dismantled to end this form of ecological apartheid? Are there global best practices? Are they replicable at scale? And what are the real opportunities to build robust and fair food systems rather than narrow focusing on the kind of intensive, capital-intensive food production that has become the predominant mode? And what is the link between nutrition and health? And what happens when that vital link is broken? And what are the implications of land grabbing on the continent on sustainable food systems? The COVID-19 pandemic has affected food system, exposing deep inequities and weaknesses in our food systems. What lessons are emerging out of the crises, and how could they inform new practices that could lead to reconnecting social, economic, ecological connections between people, land, and food? These are some of this is the frame that we hope that some of the dialogue will occur within. So really today's conversation can also be called, I suppose, a comprehensive conversation, as we can clearly see the conversion of solutions if we address the issue of ecological apartheid. So with these opening remarks, I will now hand over to our wonderful moderator, Nazifo Shabalala, and extend a warm welcome to our panelists. It's been a privilege to get to know you individually, and I now hand over to all of you. Thank you, Nazifo.
Thank you so much, Piyushi. And of course, with just that framing and some of those questions that you've brought to the surface, you've given us so much to begin to think about. And I hope it is an invitation that our audience is leaning into, because before I introduce my panelists, I'm going to extend an invitation to our global audience and say to them, we do have the Q&A functionality as part of our platform, and we're inviting you to send through your questions and send through your comments and be included in this critically important conversation. I do want to build on one or two things that you've said, Piyushi, because I think they are important for contextualizing the conversation. The first of these is that when we are talking about ecological apartheid, we are really looking at by definition, the state of apartness and unequal access to resources of nature that lead to unjust and unfair impact on the most vulnerable. I think it's going to be very important that we coalesce around a common understanding before we get into the conversation. I do also want to highlight and just acknowledge both the foundation, but also the partners that have made this conversation possible for us, especially the Visa Foundation and the Skoll Foundation. One of the things I know Piyushi is quite very, very passionate about is this beautiful link that we're seeing between the last peace lecture and the conversation today. And to build on that beautiful quote from the Archbishop Piyushi, is that, of course, in the last peace lecture, he did encourage all of us to join him in the fight for climate justice. And so this conversation is adding to that urgency, and it's adding to that call to action as we move forward. And so I'm going to also invite our audience that is on social media, because I know there are so many platforms of which we can bring attention to this conversation in the world. The two hashtags that we are using today is hashtag ecological apartheid and hashtag courageous conversation. But I think, Piyushi, you've said it well. It's a comprehensive, courageous conversation that we're having today. You might notice that we're also streaming live on Facebook, and that's really to bring the conversation and make it accessible to as many people as possible. Now, with all of that said, it's time to really introduce our panelists who are really going to be holding this conversation and leading it. Piyushi's already acknowledged her, but Dr. Vandana Shiva, thank you for being here. Dr. Shiva is an Indian scholar. She's an environmental activist, a food sovereignty advocate, an ecofeminist, and an anti-globalisation author. She's based in Delhi, so we do appreciate the time that you've taken to be with us on this time zone. She's written more than 20 books and counting, I'm sure. And oftentimes, she is referred to as the Gandhi of grain. And this is because of her activism associated with seed and food sovereignty. So it's an absolute privilege. It's an absolute honor for us to have her. We also have Professor Ruth Hall with us, and she, of course, is a professor at PLAS. PLAS, of course, is the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, and this at the University of the Western Cape. She's a political scientist by training. She specializes in politics and the political economy of agrarian reform and land distribution and poverty. So Professor Hall, thank you very much for making the time to be with us. And we're certainly going to be tapping your expertise to bring us the continental as well as the national perspective. And of course, this conversation would be incomplete without Ms. Busisiwe Ngandlela, who is here with us in her capacity as a director at Sakiwo Agricultural Cooperative. And she brings into this conversation her very unique lived experience as a farmer that has also had the experience of being a healthcare worker as a nurse. And so, Piyushi, to that question that you raised earlier for us, that linkage between nutrition and health and what happens when that link is disconnected is certainly a conversation that we're going to be seeking to have with her. Once again, the invitation to you, our audience, is open to invite you to send us your comments and your questions. And so welcome, Vandana, welcome, Ruth, welcome, Busisiwe. I'm going to start us off by inviting you to help us really scope the central problem and to help us surface its components by asking you to really share with us how ecological apartheid manifests and plays itself out in your respective space. So, Vandana, when you look at ecological apartheid from a global viewpoint, how does its existence play itself out on people and planet? Can I invite you to unmute, please?
First, thank you to the Desmond Tutu Foundation and to my fellow panelists for a platform that is so timely. While we are talking here, there is a huge food summit taking place where protests are happening. Most of the movements, most of the scientists, and most of the UN officials, including the UN Rapporteur on Food, have rejected this corporate summit. Apartheid means separateness. That comes from the Afrikaans language, which is so unique to South Africa. And it was during a UN Assembly on Harmony with Nature and Redefining Our Relationship with Nature that a South African and I, who are part of the Rights of Nature movement, Cormac, we articulated the separateness from nature, the illusion of separateness from nature, because apartheid is illusionary. The idea of races being inferior and superior is an illusion. The idea that we are separate from nature is an illusion, and that's what I mean by ecological apartheid. And the two go hand in hand. The foundation is in Cape Town. 1652, the Cape was colonized. Within 50 years, the indigenous people had been dispossessed. 50 short years. Most people forget that Dutch East India Company colony was actually a food colony. They were growing food for the ships that went past the Cape. And apartheid was already very much part of it. 1885, a law was passed against the Indians because an Indian went to practice trade and try and buy land in Transvaal. And when they protested against this, this is what the President Kruger said: "You are descendants of Ishmael, and therefore your very birth bound to slave for the descendants of Esau. As the descendants of Esau, we cannot admit you to rights placing you on an equality with ourselves. You must rest content with what rights we grant to you." This includes resource rights. So ecological apartheid and the normal understanding of apartheid were born together in South Africa and then exported to the world. Most people don't realize that 80% of the early slaves were picked up from India, and then the indentured labor became free. I won't go into that history, but for those who want to know more, this is Gandhi's book on South Africa. Because as President Mandela said, you sent us Gandhi, we sent you the Mahatma. But it was the South African struggles and soils and the fight against discrimination that led Gandhi to join the people when an Asiatic law was passed in August 22nd, 1966, discriminating against Indians. And 8 years Gandhi spent. And that is where he began Satyagraha, the force of truth. This is what Mandela then followed up with. 1948 is when formally an apartheid policy is institutionalized. And then 1994, you get freedom. Ecological apartheid and the apartheid of race are two sides of the same coin. Because those who colonized were white And they just decided we can use our whiteness to tell everyone else, you'll be our slave, your land will be our land, your seeds will be our seeds, your trade will be our trade. This is ecological apartheid. It's economic, it's nutritional. The fact that people are hungry, and Desmond Tutu mentions this so clearly, it is a result of the structures that continue and have just got sharper because the tools of inequality have been perfected to higher levels of violence. But we can come to that later.
Sure. I have been scribbling as you're speaking, because a lot of what you're raising for us, you know, especially as you get to the last point, Vandana, where you speak about the two sides of the same coin. And obviously the big question that comes to mind is one system was dismantled and the other was perpetuated. And you almost get us back to the realization, as you say, the tools of inequality have been sharpened over time. When we get to really unpacking and exploring the roots versus just the symptoms of this conversation, I'm certainly hoping that you're going to share some of those tools with us so that we can really understand the extent of dismantling that needs to take place. But as an opening statement, I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for raising Gandhi's book. Another book that's been raised in this conversation is Raymond Orbach. And Raymond, I hope I'm saying your surname correctly in the chat. And Raymond is saying, oh, I know Vandana, Ruth, and Sisbusi very well, and so happy to see all of you together. And he's also saying my book on organic food systems can be downloaded free of charge. So beautiful that we might be able to share resources as well and encourage more interaction as we go along. Ruth, let me come to you. Let's bring this from a global perspective and come home to a continental and even a national perspective. What does ecological apartheid look like from a land reform perspective in South Africa? And what is the link to food systems in the country? I'm sure you might have some comments on the statement that Vandana made, that apartheid and ecological apartheid were both born in South Africa and exported to the rest of the world. I'd love your reaction to that as well.
Thanks so much. I think it's very apt and humbling that we hear from Vandana, you know, that we are an extreme example of inequality, but not exceptional. And many have made this point, including Mahmoud Mamdani so eloquently. But in a sense, I wanted to say firstly that I think that we should think about a crisis that is multidimensional but integrated. And it's a crisis of food, it's a crisis of climate, it's a crisis of land, and it's a crisis of inequality. And I think that within South Africa, a lot of government initiatives, research, civil society and social movement responses have tended to deal with these separately. And I think that that is really, so if we're having a courageous conversation to try and say something different from what we normally say, it's about connecting those in a new way. I've traditionally worked on land issues. I wouldn't call myself a climate person, but we all need to be climate people now. We need to all think about ecology now. So the problem that we see, I think, in South Africa, if we just think in a very recent context, last year, with the COVID crisis hitting, within the first quarter of lockdown, 47% of households went without food before the end of the month. Nearly half of all households in South Africa could not feed themselves. And particularly women, and not only women, but adults were sheltering children from hunger and shifting their food, shifting their diets away from proteins, away from fresh produce towards cheap staple foods and processed foods. That's what's cheap for poor people. At the same time, agriculture was held up by government as the shining light of an economy in crisis. Agriculture's GDP contribution grew 15% in the year to the financial year 2020, and at the same time that output was growing, the agricultural economy was robust. there was an 8% loss in farm jobs as farmers pushed farm workers off. At the same time, we see rapidly increasing food price inflation, so much so that those people who did manage to get the social relief of distress COVID grant of a mere 350 Rand, for those households receiving just one, that entire grant would have gone purely in food price inflation. In other words, it was a direct transfer from the public fiscus into a supermarket-dominated food system, right? So I think the fact that our agricultural sector produces more than enough in most staple foods for domestic consumption, we have a dramatic a chronic problem of food insecurity, but also a rising acute problem that is more extreme than it has been. A lot of our welfare indicators are back 20 years to before we introduced things like the child support grant. So, and in the same week that the second wave of what's called the NIDS CRAM survey, which looked at the impacts of COVID on incomes, showed these devastating figures of hunger, Shoprite declared its year-on-year profit to September last year, which was 8 billion Rand. That was about 20 times more than the state had spent on food relief during COVID. So we can see that actually crisis was quite profitable for the corporate food sector. The entire state relief program for small-scale farmers was channeled through a small number of input industries that provide seed and other inputs for farming. So all of the state subsidies for relief were fed either via low-income households into the supermarket sector or via input suppliers into global and mostly multinational seed companies. So we can see how again and again, in trying to deal with crisis, the way that the state is responding to governing a food crisis, a health crisis, an economic crisis, is actually shoring up one part of the food system. If we think about what isn't being shored up, it's that 40% of the township food economy is informal. It's street traders. You know, the vast majority of farmers, in fact, in South Africa are small-scale Black farmers, but they account for so little. They account for so little of the total profit. So we have this incredibly lopsided figure where about 2/3 of all agricultural income goes to about 6% of commercial farms. So again and again, and I know that many people will say, well, we're not an agrarian society. Why should we do land reform? I think that firstly, we need to recognize that we have jobless de-agrarianization, an enormous population of people who are neither agrarian, but nor is there an industrial revolution happening. And we see a lot of pressure and demand for land and for income on the periphery of our cities. And this is part of, not the whole story, but I think part of what we saw exploding over the past few weeks. But you know, the food riots that were expected a year ago didn't materialize. But what I think we do see very clearly is that we see scarcity and abundance, profit and hunger at the same time, in a country which, by the way, is incredibly open in terms of its regulation of agriculture. We are one of the fastest adopters of GM seed. We deregulated our trade, and yet we have a hungry population in the midst of profitable agribusiness. That, I think, is part of our problem.
Sure. So Ruth, I think, again, some really salient points raised. Roger Arendse had a question, and I think you've kind of answered your question, answered Roger in what you've just shared with us, but I am just going to acknowledge Roger's voice, where Roger is saying, is big business, big pharma, and big tech exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to entrench ecological apartheid? And what are the consequences for global humanity given the current fixation on vaccine rollouts? Now, that's the question from Roger. So, you know, I can see you thinking it, but let's go to you, Ruth, and I'd love for you just to quickly respond to Roger before we move on from this point that you've just raised yourself.
I think that that's a very important question. I think, listen, the argument that land should not be touched because of national food security, there shouldn't be redistribution because of food security, is a standard trope used to defend the existing situation. I think that both when it comes to food production and access to land, the arguments of scarcity, the narrative of scarcity is usually used as a basis to justify continued exclusion. And I think that we see that again and again in South Africa. As for how big industry is strategizing, I think that's a very important issue. I think that how the state negotiated with big agricultural corporates about how to design the relief program needs to be investigated. And I think we should come back to this later when we think about what needs to be done. My sense is that a lot of academic research has been focusing so much on symptoms of poverty, and what we should be doing is linking up across these spheres of climate, food, land, and the food system, and thinking about how to research corporate power. We should be thinking about a linked up process of trying to understand how the key actors and their strategies.
So the title of the thesis needs to shift to corporate power instead of the symptoms of poverty. And I love the invitation that you raised to say, you know, we are going to look at some of those root causes and symptoms. And when we do, Shadra, I've just seen your comment. I'm certainly going to be bringing it in because Shadra is asking, saying, she's saying, thank you, Ruth, though I would like to ask if it's land that we need or support to integrate into sustainable food systems. I'm going to park that question because we are going to get to that. But Shadra, thank you for sending that question through. I do want to bring in Busisiwe. Thank you very much, Busisiwe, for joining us. The question I just want to bring to you, and again, really appreciating your lived experience as a small local indigenous farmer, what in your view is ecological apartheid, and what has been your personal experience of it, so that when we begin to think about, you know, how do we overcome this apartness, what is it necessarily from a lived perspective?
Good afternoon, everybody. As introduced, my name is Busisiwe Mkangela, and I'm known as Mamu Peter by farmers in the Eastern Cape. I'm a member of South African Organic Sector Organization. Thank you so much to the Tutu Foundation for giving me this chance. Ecological apartheid to me as a farmer, it goes as follows. Colonialism has not ended, but it has taken a different manifestation. Rural and small-scale farmers are being enslaved by corporate business that think they are superior because they have money. Farmers have no say in pricing of their produce. Value is determined some way. Consumer councils having more say than producers, than farmers who are tilling the land. Government programs are favoring farmers with huge hectareage of land vis-a-vis the small-scale farmers. Monocropping with GMOs of maize and soya beans in South Africa. And traditional seed, that is the seed that has got resilience, is seen as inferior, and it is not yielding. It is being demonized by the multinationals and corporate and big business. There's degraded land, more especially in the Eastern Cape, you'll see gullies, and all that is because of ecological apartheid. Access to clean nutrition food is for the highly earning people, the high flung, which is not supposed to be, because every citizen in South Africa is supposed to have access to clean nutritional food. And the land issue, more especially for women in particular, women don't have title deeds. It's either the land is registered under their husbands or their brothers, because they are not seen as people that could have title deeds. So to me, that is apartheid at its best. And the injustices of seed laws, as I said, that they are demonizing our seed, our traditional seed. these seed laws are favoring the multinationals. And if again you look at corruption by government officials with land reform and allocation of farms, together with the funding, that is the support that is supposed to be there. So that is apartheid. That is all discrediting the farmers on the ground. Then how would we overcome this? What should we do? What do we do as small-scale farmers that are being enslaved by this corporate business? We should fight for what we know. We should fight for what we believe. And what we know is that soil is the thing that is going to be giving us resilience, that is going to be giving us food that is so nutritious. So the government should listen to what the small-scale farmers are saying. Small-scale farmers are so tired of monocropping. They are tired of the ecology that is not looked at. They are crying together with Mother Earth because Mother Earth is bleeding. The soil is bleeding. The rivers are bleeding. We need sustainable food systems. Indigenous knowledge systems, they need to be a reality and not just to be a lip service. Listen to the indigenous people. Listen to what they are saying and deal with corrupt officials and not reward them with suspensions with pay or just move them to other departments. This is really something that is very much crucial, and it is making the farmers not to do what they like to do because of these corruptions. And again, we need to look to what the environment is saying. Listen to the earth. It is telling us something. Thank you.
Sure, and that is the voice of the lived experience coming through. Listen to the earth. It is telling us. And the question is, of course, are we listening? And you've raised so many issues, a lot of them aligning to what we've heard from Ruth and Vandana. Vandana spoke about the Dutch East India Company, and you've taken it all the way back to colonialism, and you've reminded us, some of these tools that I think Vandana was referring to as well, that have been sharpened over time, that keep a lot of this the systems that underpin ecological apartheid in place. You've spoken about the plight of indigenous farmers and small-scale farmers, the misalignment between government policy and its intent and the actual impact that it has on small-scale farmers. But you've also spoken about practices that we can't believe are still in place. For example, title deed and land practices that still marginalize women. So much, we have so much that needs to be engaged with. Now, there's a lot of coming through, and I do want to say to my panelists, if you want me to integrate your voice into the conversation, try and keep your contribution short, sharp, and concise so I can pull it in quickly. I'm seeing some beautiful text, but very long to read in the midst of a very dynamic and fast-moving conversation. So, Vandana, let me come back to you. And before I come to you with your next question, let's pull a couple of the voices from the audience. Sharon is saying, are we forgetting water here in this conversation? Saying, should we not also highlight water as one of the key components that is used to continue this ecological exclusion, both in terms of quantity and suffering and well-being, because all of that impacts of rapidly deteriorating water quality, mainly through big commercial enterprises such as mining and big agribusinesses. Vandana, let me get your voice here. Have we missed something, or are we assuming that water is part of the conversation? Let's hear from you. Kindly asking you to unmute once again, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So we really have two models of agriculture. One is indigenous, which constantly evolves, it's not static, and it feeds the world. 80% of the food we eat comes from small farms today, 2021, according to the FAO, and they use a small 25% of the land, just as much as all indigenous people using a tiny bit of the land conserve 80% of the biodiversity. So we are constantly made to believe that the 75% land, which is providing 20% of bad food, nutritionally empty toxic food, is feeding the world. And that myth keeps getting repeated again and again. I've written a whole book on who really feeds the world for the Milan Expo. Why did I get involved in agriculture? It's not my background. I'm trained in physics. I looked at agriculture because in 87, Punjab, the land where the Green Revolution was first introduced, with violence, with imposition, with World Bank and Rockefeller Foundation and USAID and the US government just forcing it on us when we had a little drought and needed a little more wheat. It was a chemical revolution. It was not green. It was a toxic revolution. And it was not a revolution because revolutions grow from the base. This was forced from the top. This was in the 60s. By 84, and I'd done my MSc honors in particle physics in Punjab University, prosperous, peaceful, rich, abundant land. By 84, it had erupted in violence. So I started to study. I was doing work for the United Nations University. I said, I want to study the conflicts in Punjab. And I did my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution. Number one, it did not produce more food. It produced more rice and wheat, monocultures, at the cost of all the grains, at the cost of the millets, at the cost of the oilseeds, at the cost of the pulses, at the cost of the vegetables. And coming back to the question on water, it uses 10 times more water to produce the same amount of food because chemicals need water. Why do they need water? Because otherwise they literally, as farmers will tell you, they burn the soil. So you have to irrigate to just dissolve these chemicals. Second, a very important part of this issue is that they've destroyed the soil's capacity to hold water, which means you have to constantly irrigate. So the crops are thirsty, the soil becomes thirsty, and you end up using 10 times more. 75% of the water problem is related to industrial agriculture, which is not feeding the world either. It's caused 1 billion people's hunger. It is, as I've written in some of my texts, this invasive agriculture is going into the forest, is going into the Indonesian rainforest for palm oil, into the Amazon for soya oil, is behind the new emerging epidemics. 300 of them, the Ebolas, the HIV, it's all forest invasions. Why do they have to invade into forests if they were so efficient? They're not working on the same piece of land. They're constantly taking over more. The Green Revolution was the first time they started to tamper with the seed. Till that time, the only seed that there was real seed. Bija, we say, the seed that arises from itself and has been bred by farmers. One wild grass made into 200,000 rice varieties. One teosinte in Mexico turned into 150,000 maize varieties. We are really talking of a chemical-driven agriculture that changed the plant. And this is how the dwarf varieties were created. And Norman Borlaug was given a Nobel Peace Prize for poisoning the world. This is what has caused the farmers' protest 84 and the continuing protest for 8 months in India. This is now in Africa under the name of the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, driven by Bill Gates. What is the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa? GMO seeds, commodity supply chains. Where did the seed issue go wrong? Seed issue went wrong because having tampered with the seed, the chemical industry realized they should control the seed. And I happened to be at a meeting in 87 where they literally said, we now must own the seed and we must make it illegal for farmers to have their own seed. And this is how the WTO intellectual property rights laws were written by Monsanto. They said, we were the patient, diagnostician, or physician all in one. So patenting seed is the new colonialism. When I talked earlier about the tools of colonialism being sharpened, earlier they grabbed the land. Now they're grabbing biodiversity. That time they said the land is empty. Those Africans are not really people. Therefore, their land is ours to grab. Terra nullius was the legal jurisprudence they created. Now it's bio nullius, life is empty. And with the digitalization of agriculture, they're basically saying the farmer's mind is empty. I call it mente nullius. Has it delivered? No, it hasn't. The Green Revolution has ruined Punjab. It has destroyed water. Industrial agriculture, globalized agriculture is responsible for 75% soil destruction, 75% water destruction, 80% biodiversity destruction, 50% greenhouse gas emissions, 75% chronic diseases, and of course, hunger. We won't have hunger if we listen to the earth, as Bussy said so beautifully. All we have to do is listen to the earth, listen to women, listen to indigenous voices. That is how we transform the food system to ensure that 4 corporations who are toxic corporations, I call them the poison cartel, don't control our seed. 4 corporations that are the monopolies in grain trade, the Cargills, don't control the trade. 4 corporations don't take good food and turn it into junk and then use subsidies to make it cheap, as Ruth pointed out. It's cheap, not because it's cheap to produce and process and add more additives. It's very costly, but it becomes cheap through subsidies. If they had to pay for all the aluminum in the packaging, all the fossil fuels in the plastic, all the long distance transport, all of this is subsidized by our governments, by our money. And so the big issue is we are subsidizing the killing of our agriculture. We are subsidizing the killing of our health. We are subsidizing the vulnerability to the COVIDs. This agriculture survives only because it has the support of our public money and the hijack of our government. What's happening at the Food Summit right now is the hijack of the United Nations. The United Nations is being privatized. It used to be one country, one vote. Now it is the billionaires with the only votes. So not only do we have to take back our democracy, we've got to deepen it into what I call earth democracy. And by listening to the seed is where I learned earth democracy. You've got to listen to the earth, listen to the seed, listen to nature, listen to our cultures. We have been, the colonial attitude was make them feel inferior. That is what education is about. There was a Macaulay's millet in India. Make them feel inferior, they'll take everything, all the nonsense we give them. So decolonization begins with the mind. And that means we have to reclaim our cultures of the land. That is the first return of land. That's the first land back movement.
Sure. So we're talking, I'm trying my best not to get us into the solutions because, but I am hearing decolonization is the starting point. And there's so much that you raised for us, Vandana, both from just giving us a historical understanding of how we actually got here and those pivotal moments in history where conversations and decisions were made to whether it was intellectual property rights around seed and patenting seeds, whether it was, the evolution of grabbing biodiversity. You've given us such a rich context to understand how did we get here. Nikki says, Vandana, and I just want to bring your attention to this. It's more of a statement, but I think it's something that you've touched on. Nikki is saying, keeping the population unhealthy through food is a tool of colonial oppression. I would imagine that that is something you would agree with, given what you've just shared with us.
Yeah, and there was an earlier question,
Yes.
on the big pharma and the big billionaires and big tech.
Yes.
We mustn't forget that fossil fuels are the raw material for both big pharma as well as agrochemicals. Poison cartel, the Bayers, the Monsantos, the BASFs are all the originators of the poisons in agriculture, but they also became big pharma. Rockefeller Foundation was Standard Oil. Rockefeller Foundation worked with Hitler and IG Farben, but Rockefeller Foundation also began the first allopathic drugs and the whole pharmaceutical industry. So big poison and big pharma go hand in hand. Big poison gives us cancer. Big pharma sells us the patented cancer drugs. And, Africa and India had such a strong relationship in the fight against patents on AIDS medicine. It was Cipla, our company, said, I can provide for $200 instead of the $25,000. And that agreement between South Africa and India is what led to the suing of South Africa by the big pharma. And then it eventually led to the public health declaration in the WTO. And now the whole issue of vaccines, those who pretend to be there to help have created a vaccine apartheid. And they had the patents on vaccines even before they had the vaccines. So we can see patents are about the old colonial extractivism, the poll tax, the Lagan, the rent collection. And it's now carrying on in every aspect of life. Every day the stories in India are, men are crying because one relative went into hospital. The whole family is sunk in debt that they'll never be able to pay. They'll sell their land, they'll sell their homes, and they'll still not be able to pay the debt. So big pharma is a big criminal in today's world. And we have tried Monsanto for crimes against nature, humanity, farmers. I think this group of chemical companies are now, they are hijacking the World Food Summit, or the Food Summit.
Right.
I think the new movement we need is how to bring them under control. That is the regulatory issue, because they've created a dysregulation where they cannot be controlled. And that is exactly what the apartheid regime was all about.
And we're going to get to solutioning in a while, because I think, you know, you're really beginning to give us some of those insights of what is the so what? What do we do about this? Naila, I see your comment and I will get to it because I think it's a brilliant question, Vandana. The question is, how do we take back our cultures? But we're going to get to that question. Ruth, I'm going to come to you when we talk about whether we're really focusing on the right roots of the problem. Before I do that, I just want to quickly circle back to Busisiwe. Busisiwe, one of the comments that Vandana has made, she's made that link between, and it's both Vandana and I would say also Nikki in her question, the link between nutrition and health. And so I want to come to you because you have that dual experience of being a healthcare worker, now a farmer. How did that disconnection come about between nutrition and health? And what happens when this link is broken deliberately?
Yes, you know, it's so amazing because I was a nurse. I trained as a professional nurse and then went on to advance as a nurse educator and a nurse administrator. And in there, I was dealing with students of nursing who I was teaching that they should be giving the health education to clients about good nutrition, well-balanced diets. And it was only after I was trained in agroecology where I saw the difference between the food systems that are there. Because industrial agriculture does not offer crops of plants or food that is highly nutritious. Yet sustainable agriculture does that. When you build your soil, when you build your soil fertility, putting organic matter in there, the crops that you are getting from that soil, because the soil was meant to feed the plants with minerals, with micronutrients, with essential amino acids, with amino acids. But then with the healthcare system, there's not a such in the education. And as nurses, because we were telling that nutrition is better than cure as the first level of primary prevention. And now after I had known of agroecology, I knew that I was giving my students a raw deal. I was giving my clients a raw deal because then chronic illnesses, they stem from does not have food that does not have nutrients. You will get your chronic illnesses, your asthmas, your cardiacs, your hypertension, your diabetes. And because then the nutritious food will build your immune system, the immune system that will be able to take away the viruses, the bacteria that are so opportunistic in these days, because then we don't have that a nutrient-dense food, and the food that is out there in the supermarkets is not nutritious at all. So that is where now my nutrition and health and farming came from. There was even like my students would tease me and say, "You've left us in nursing," and I would say, "No, I haven't left because I'm taking care of the soil so that it takes care of the plants and the plants will take care of the clients." And that is where my nursing now is embedded in the grassroots. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Busisiwe. So that intersectionality is so critical as we're listening to you sharing that, and that we have to look at these things in their multiplicity and not through the singular lenses. Sure. Okay. So Ruth, after listening to a lot of those contributions, and we come back to the fact that, you know, we look at, for example, land inequality in South Africa, and we can see that increasingly big swathes of the planet are increasingly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy few. I think Vandana gave us a figure in terms of what those numbers look like as well. Firstly, in your view, what practices, and I think one of the language we've been using today is tools, what tools or what practices continue to perpetuate land inequality? But more importantly, Ruth, do you think that we're actually dealing with the real roots of the problem in how we are approaching land reform efforts?
Thanks, Nazipo. So I suppose if we were to say what really underlies these inequalities, well, actually, at its base, the enclosure and privatization of land, but also water, minerals, the oceans, forests, the privatization and commodification of all of nature underpins these inequalities. So in South Africa, we have a particular history of colonial dispossession, entrenched and organized further through apartheid. By the way, that pattern of dispossession, of privatization and monopolization of natural resources is not something that I think we often get it wrong when we describe this as a legacy of apartheid. It's actually continuing. So if you ask what are the mechanisms through which it's continuing, one way of looking at that is let's look at agriculture. The apartheid government did a very effective land reform for poor whites and established a large number of family farmers on the land through massive subsidy. And so this is a sector, a capitalist farming sector built through subsidy. And at its height in the mid-50s, there were about 120,000 farming units, commercial farming units. That dropped to about half that, 60,000 by the 90s. We're currently below 40,000. So the dynamics of concentration continue and in fact accelerated after the ANC government liberalized our economy, opened up our trade and deregulated it, removed all the mechanisms of support. So the processes that we see of liberalization in South Africa, we often see as particular to us. In fact, this is very much part of what was happening elsewhere in the world, either through structural adjustment in the 1980s through much of Africa, but also at the moment of the end of the Cold War, you know, and the Washington Consensus and the rolling back of the state. So I think that this long history of enclosure, privatization, and now the rolling back of the state, and at the moment of democracy in South Africa coming alongside the sort of neoliberal ideas of development, which is that we will, you know, unencumber the state with owning the assets. The state will tie its own hands. And this is precisely what the South African state has done. It has tied its own hands, which is why now 25 years later, we're arguing about changing the constitution, because the state has chosen not to use its powers to enact reforms across these areas. And I think that, you know, I'm glad that somebody, Sharon, I think, raised the issue of water. Because there we have, you know, we had land apartheid, we had water apartheid, we had minerals apartheid, everything. But we have nationalized the water, but we failed to redistribute it, right? We've nationalized the minerals, but we failed to redistribute those rights. So we could nationalize the land, but the question is, what is the mechanism of redistribution, whether you nationalize or not? So I wanted to emphasize that agriculture and the dispossession of land is not a linear, it's not like something that happened in the past, it continues. And alongside that, I think essentially we see that replicated through the system. So I'm glad that Vandana pointed out 4 massive seed monopolies globally, 4 mega grain trading companies. But in South Africa, as well, we have the same seed companies, many of which are moving into the rest of the continent through South Africa as a base. We have 4 really big food processing companies that increasingly are monopolizing through mergers and acquisitions more and more of our food system. And we have 4 big retail outlets. Now, there was a very important article, I'm sure some people have seen, by Mark Swilling last week, and it was reflecting on some of the politics of the recent looting and rioting, much of which didn't have to do with food, but some of which did. And he writes very importantly, drawing on the work by Jane Battersby at UCT, And he points out that this concentration that I've described in primary agriculture has been happening throughout, including at the retail end. By the beginning of the 90s, only about 10% of all food in South Africa was sold via supermarket chains, okay? Most people were buying food from the corner shop, the vegetable shop, and the informal sector. 10 years later, this figure was 60%. By 2010, it was 68%. That was the highest in the world. And by 2017, 75% of all groceries in South Africa were sold through primarily just the 4 supermarkets. So we can see how throughout our food system, it's this concentration. It's in input supply, it's in the primary production, it's in the processing, and it's in the retail. And it's getting tighter and tighter. And as I say, the original privatization is the basis, but it's the rolling back of the state and the opening up of our economy. And the assumption that the state is merely the facilitator for big business. And I think that this is, so if we to problematize it, we need to link our discussion around social grants, which are a major injection of public money into the economy. We need to link that to where people are spending their money and how we can create spaces that allow poor people as actors in the food system to benefit from it and to keep money circulating in communities rather than going immediately through to sites of corporate profit.
Ruth, I think there's so much that you've shared, and I really wanted to go into the conversation around land grabbing on the continent, but you've also more than once in this conversation brought in the recent looting, and I want to just double click on that a little bit. There's a lot of talk now and conversation about rebuilding, but nobody's really talking about rebuilding communities or rebuilding the township economy, talking about rebuilding big business, which we know was the target of many of the protests and actions of looting that we saw. Are we missing a critical opportunity here to rethink how we might get almost move power back into the hands of the majority of South Africans who are actually living in townships, who are actually now even probably more reliant on what should be robust food systems, as many jobs now are also lost because of what we've just gone through. I'm interested to hear your comments on, is the focus on the right thing when we talk about rebuilding in this context?
Thanks. Firstly, let's just remember that all the big supermarket chains, big supply stores, whatever they were, even outside of food, and the shopping malls themselves are all covered by insurance. What's not covered are the small-scale farmers, the bakkie traders, and the street hawkers whose livelihoods have been decimated. And as with the early period of lockdown last year, the big crisis for small farmers is not inputs, but the crisis is a lack of access to markets. And to me, I think that we're actually running a research project right now in collaboration with some civil society organizations in KZN and in Gauteng, as well as in the Western Cape, looking at small-scale fishers. But what we're hearing from people is that, firstly, what small-scale farmers, particularly women, are saying is what they want to do is they want to be able to supply locally. But the big buyer in the area is the school feeding program, which is now centralizing its tender process. So there you have small-scale women farmers producing a surplus of vegetables. You have starving populations, and you have big companies from elsewhere getting tenders to supply school feeding programs. So I think that public procurement and the use of state funds to procure from small-scale farmers is absolutely crucial. And it's outrageous that this has been proposed for more than 20 years and we don't see significant move in this direction. I think that's one very concrete thing that can be talked about. Why on earth are the women, the mothers and others who are producing the food not being able to supply their own communities? And I think that there are other things, particularly local government elections may or may not be coming up, but local government can play a key role in making available space. the way in which we support shopping malls with big retail chains to dominate our food system is actually another subsidy. And again, how local government treats its land becomes a subsidy for wealth and accumulation, not on the food side, but just an aside. An example right here in Cape Town is the continued leasing out of prime public land for golf clubs. The Rondebosch and King David Mowbray Golf Club. This is about giving prime land and water to almost for free for elite sports purposes in places that would link areas previously separated under the Group Areas Act, and would give, if used for low-income housing, would give poor people access to homes close to hospitals and schools. So here again, I think that the role of local government is key, and the state's public procurement systems are key. But there are many other things we can talk about as we continue.
So Vandana, I saw you nodding quite a bit as Ruth was sharing some of those ideas. I would love to hear what's behind those nods if you'd like to comment, but also if you could just take on this question, please, Vandana. This was the question from Naila, and Naila was saying, how do we begin to take back our cultures? It seems many of us have forgotten that knowledge and we need to relearn it. And of course, this was on the back of you speaking to us about taking back our culture and really being deliberate about the process of decolonization. Let's bring your voice in here, Vandana.
Yeah. So, when I started Navdanya to save seeds in '87, the corporations had said by the year 2000, no farmer will have their own seed. And the Green Revolution that anyway made farmers forget seed breeding, because seed was now something that was supplied, the improved seed. And our seeds were called primitive. And when I was looking at the root of primitive, all it means is original. Those of us who are called primitive are the original people. The original seeds are the primitive seeds. Primitive is a compliment because it is about belonging and it's about being rooted. So the issue right now is we have been made to forget, Forgetting is part of colonialism. And decolonization is remembering. And of course you remember, I started a grandmother's university because the grandmothers still remember. So we have to start responding and respecting our grandmothers. I think we have to start looking around the world. We have to look internally into indigenous culture. There was also a comment by a chef who said, Africa has no food culture. When I won the Neem case, there was a Neem biopiracy, and I came to Nairobi for the big convention on biological diversity, straight from the big tree in Geneva, in Munich. And Wangari was with me, Wangari Maathai, and we had the celebration. And I just told the women, I said, just get all the village women to cook indigenous dishes, 150 dishes. The point is we've got so focused on the 10 commodity crops. And then if you don't have that commodity crop in the culture before, you think they didn't have food. But no culture is foodless, because food is what we've evolved with. Even, if they're now being work done on Australia, which is called the Bushmen, they just went around to the bush. They are the oldest farmers of the world, 60,000 years of farming. They were growing crops 60,000 years ago. And now new restaurants are coming up, remembering all the foods that are forgotten. We call this forgotten foods. The discussion that Ruth was having, the SDG 2, which is called Zero Hunger, it grew from Brazil. And Brazil passed a public procurement law that all school feeding programs must be based on local agroecological food. That's where Zero Hunger came. The other day, I gave an award to Denmark. Copenhagen has 80% local procurement. So when we are told it's not doable, we work in Italy, my colleagues in Navdanya International. The bio districts of local food are springing up everywhere. Now, when I started working on globalization and the intellectual property and the 3 treaties that were brought by the corporations were intellectual property to own the seed, Cargill saying free trade, dump everything, dump with subsidies, destroy agriculture, and then the junk food industry.
Yeah.
To rewrite the rules of food safety so that junk food is safe and indigenous becomes unsafe. They're now moving to the next step of this, where the Gates, and with this Gates Ag One has a program called Ag One, linked with the buyers for farming without farmers. They want the land. He's also the biggest landowner farm landowner in America. And he wants all the land of the world through conditionalities linked to climate change. It'll take too long to explain this, but I have a new book coming out, From the Economy of Greed to the Economy of Care.
Cool.
And I think that's the economies we need to see. But because I know we'll be running short of time, let me just talk about the actions. Can I just?
I
or you want a separate section?
Yes, I want to go. I do want us to go to actions, but I maybe want to go about it in a different route, if with your permission, Vandana. I want to go to Busisiwe first, because I think one of the things Vandana has raised in helping us think about how do we claim back our culture is part of the solution. And I know that Busisiwe, you've been doing a lot of work in terms of ecological, organic culture and other practices that you're supporting in terms of supporting other smallholder farmers to adopt. Let's talk a little bit about that and how is that part of the solution that we need? Because right now I want us to talk about what needs to be done, by whom, and how does this link to our call to action, which is to dismantle ecological apartheid. So Busisiwe, to you first, how are farmers harnessing ecological organic culture and other practices to dismantle the system?
Thank you so much. First, I would like to comment on what Ruth and Vandana said about school nutrition, because that one is supposed to be a market for smallholder farmers, but already it has got a partners on it, because the criterion that is needed there, where for you to be having to feed the school nutrition program, in the school nutrition program, you need to have a gap, which is a good agricultural practice. That is good, that could be needed. But then for you to be certified gap, you need to have infrastructure, which is a huge challenge for smallholder farmers. You need to have a water license, which is also a barrier for smallholder farmers. So you'll find that then the smallholder farmers are not even able to get into that market that is supposed to be there for them, for their children that are at school, that they could be feeding with nutritious food that they are producing locally. And then coming to your question, farmers are tapping into their highest potential these days. They are promoting local food gardens, and they are promoting ecological organic agriculture, so that I think producing food using ecological organic agriculture principles. And this they are doing together with networks like Agroecology South Africa, South African Organic Sector Organizations, the Knowledge Hubs, your Sustainability Institutes, Unpoison, and all those networks that are helping the farmers to come back to that. And farmers are already going around rescuing their traditional seeds. They are into saving the seed, multiplying their traditional seed, and even having family seed banks and community seed banks. And that is how I think then farmers are trying to bring the culture back. And that reminds me, when we talk of water and the scarcity of water, my father, who was a traditional farmer back in the years, he used to take a vacation so that in spring, he can go and prepare the land, which we call ukugelesha. He was preparing the land so that by the time the summer rains come, they find that land, that the water can just be stored in the land so that it prepares for the grains that were going to be planted using dry land. So if we could go back to that culture, and in my introduction, I was saying, let the indigenous knowledge system be a practical thing and not lip service, because everybody is just talking about IKS and it is not practiced, and more especially by our government. And you know, this is very much easy. The government could achieve the sustainable development goals that are needed there just for using smallholder farmers. And I used to make this example. If you are looking at having 8,000 hectares of production, why don't you use 8,000 farmers with 1 hectare each? That would bring abundance of food. There would be ecology, there would be sustainability, because there would be intercropping, there will be, no monocropping, diversity, and everything that is needed by Mother Earth to survive. Thank you.
Busisiwe, a quick follow-up question while we're on the point of what needs to be done and by whom. What about young people? Is there scope to excite and invigorate young people so that they become positive agents of change? And maybe, you can draw from some of the work that you have done with young people as an example.
Thank you so much. Again, if we look at youth, we tend to label youth as lazy, as not wanting to come to agriculture. Have we talked to youth? Are we listening to them? Have we heard what they want? Because agriculture has got a lot of opportunities for youth. There's green technology that they can tap into. It does not have only to be working with the soil. Not that working with the soil is wrong. You'll find youth that gets enthusiastic about working the soil and being hands-on in farming. So let's talk to our youth. Let's not leave them behind. And the work that I've been doing with youth is mostly on the Importable Learning Network, which is an initiative of Rhodes University, Port Hare and Port Cox, with farmers, and which was first initiated by the Water Research Council, where we are looking at rainwater harvesting and conservation for food and livestock. So we are talking to youth and trying to call them to ecological organic agriculture, training them, mentoring them. And the way we do it in Importable Learning Network, we used to have our meetings and quarterly, and the meetings we hold, we will not hold them in boardrooms. We go to the farms, we go to farmers and talk with them and do ilima, which is a culture that was done before. We do ilima where we help. If then a farmer wants something to be done in their farm, collectively as the network, we go there, we do that, and we see the results, and we help the youth with practical so that they can see what we are talking about. It's not just something that is there theoretically. We correlate theory and practice, and then that is how we're supposed to be doing with our youth. They really want to work, but then the thing is, if we label them, they will just leave us. Thank you.
So hard lessons that have to be learned as we're thinking about the next layer of leaders that are going to be driving the process of ensuring that we've got not even less, but no apartness when it comes to this conversation of people and planet. Let me come to you, Ruth, because I'm looking, we're beginning to wrap up our conversations. We are focusing on our call to action. What needs to be done? By whom? What do we want people to be ignited to do today? And I'd love for you to maybe also share your thoughts on, given this experience that we've all gone through as a collective globally, the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, are there lessons that need to be surfaced and engaged with? Are there new practices that we need to be adopting more vigorously? And what is their potential in terms of dismantling ecological apartheid?
Thanks so much. Nozipho, what comes to mind is an astonishing moment last year during level 5, when we started to hear stories of small-scale farmers just outside Johannesburg who were sitting with surplus. They couldn't get it through their normal market channels. Some small-scale farmers around our cities sell to restaurants and to hotels. Suddenly these were all closed. They'd lost their markets. So they started to look around, well, how can we sell locally? And started to ask for spaces to sell locally. Sometimes people didn't have money, of course, to buy the food. They were giving away some food and donating it. In some cases, they were working with community action networks. Remember those? Community action networks became part of our vocabulary, an incredible form of solidarity in society and trying to build a food commons, sharing food, sharing money. And a lot of that money started to go through these networks to procure food from people, from poor, resource-poor producers to supply resource-poor consumers. So I think that the idea that it is possible to link sites of production and sites of consumption without going through several large multinationals. It is possible. And one of the events that we hosted last year was bringing together people from various countries to talk about the experiences of COVID and which communities are more resilient. One of the things that came up was about shorter, more localized value chains. Some of the things that came up was consumer cooperatives. We often think that cooperatives are for production, and not everyone wants to produce together. But the idea that consumers can get together in groups and establish long-term relationships with groups of producers, this is how a lot of, I mean, this happens at scale in parts of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, parts of Latin America, and now parts of North America, is urban populations creating long-term relationships. I think that those are interesting. I think we need targeted land reform in South Africa, not randomly buying up some farm here, some farm there, putting a group of poor people onto a big commercial farm and then blaming them when they fail. This has been our pattern, but rather targeted land reform. And I think particularly in higher rainfall areas, and around towns and cities, around the small agricultural towns, we see growing informal settlements, mostly former farm workers who've been evicted, living in places with no livelihood opportunity. I mean, it's devastating. And the demand there, and we've done land demand surveys, for instance, in the Breda River winelands area. What people want is not to become a commercial farmer, nor do they think that they'll ever get secure jobs in town. What they want is small holdings. And the strange thing is that in our policy speak in South Africa, there's so much repetition about small farmers, emerging farmers, but we never subdivide the farms. Yeah?
Yeah.
We don't target land that can be farmed intensively, and we never subdivide. So targeted, getting the right land where there's demand, and yes, expropriate to get the right land in areas where there's demand. And urban and peri-urban agriculture is definitely a priority in a society where we're 60% urbanized, and yet between a third and half of households cannot feed themselves. Well, this is an area where women who are unemployed, who are living on the margins of the cities, really want land. And, you know, it's in fresh produce, it's in livestock, including small livestock. This is where poor people with low incomes can produce food for themselves and local communities. I think that as well as building alternatives from below, we need regulation. We need regulation. We need the Competition Commission, not only to be intervening in the bread cartels and things like that, but looking at the ways in which across the whole food system, market dominance is preventing smaller actors from taking root. And I think that one of the issues, and addressing the issue of the failure to redistribute water, you know, even in the communal areas, access to water with the dismantling of most of the irrigation schemes is a big problem. So I think that, and finally, I want to say, yes, I want to emphasize the need, there is a need for research, and research partly around understanding the alternatives, because these things are not just being thought about, they're happening on the ground. But under very difficult circumstances, where are local food systems starting to thrive? Where have they always been thriving? Where are people trying to build back after COVID, after looting in KZN and Gauteng? I think we do need research on that. But also we need to be able to engage critically with the dominant orthodoxy globally, which is about climate smart agriculture. If only we can add more GMOs, more pesticide, more water, and by the way, we'll need to dispossess large populations to establish industrial agriculture across vast swathes of Africa. This is part of the dominant approach of the World Bank, is that we need to basically displace small-scale farmers, get big multinationals to produce at scale, and make Africa that kind of breadbasket. I think we need to also ask Minister Didiza, who is representing South Africa in the UN Food System Summit, to meet with citizens and to meet with a broad representation of small-scale farmers, the informal traders, and with people who are affected by the food system. It's not only producers, it's also all of us who eat. And I think that we need to call for a much more inclusive and democratic process leading up to that summit.
It sounds like a very compelling call to action. I think I've listed at least 8 actions that you're wanting us to consider as very practical next steps in terms of how we really move towards dismantling. Vandana, I want to bring the final question to you. And again, it's really, we started off with the global perspective in terms of understanding the nature of the problem. We've gone deep into understanding the realities of the local farmer. We've just heard Ruth now talking to us not only about what we need to table at our national ministers' table, but also how do we think about this at a continental level. As I call on you now, I'd love to hear from you, how do we begin to dismantle ecological apartheid? What are the underlying systems that we need to be taking on? And are there global practices, more importantly, that you think we can replicate at scale?
So we've gone through this evening on the different dimensions of ecological apartheid. The seed apartheid, which is the attempt is being made to continue it now through new gene-edited GMOs and new digital patterns, because we have won. We have won overcoming that apartheid by saying, but you don't invent the seed. It's not a machine. And in India, we wrote laws which say seeds are not machines. Seeds, animals and plants cannot be patented. I worked with Argentinian Supreme Court where they were being attacked for their law which says seeds cannot be patented. So I think we need to really set a 10-year target that across the world we need an anti-apartheid red movement to say no patents on seed. The poison cartel never invented the seed. Poisoning the seed is not an invention. And most places where people have taken this on, people have won and they've reclaimed the seed commons. The second is the land issue. That short history, very short history, New Orleans, 16, whatever, begins with the privatization of land. But before that, land was a commons in all our cultures. We had rights, and we had usufructory rights, and we had community rights, and they were sophisticated. And even today, indigenous cultures have ways of resolving this issue. I do think we will never be able to address the land question without going back to land as a commons. Because on the private property angle, there'll be conflict and conflict and conflict, and there'll be fear. But if we basically say land is a commons, it's a gift to the earth, and our duty is to take care of it, and that courage to heal, that is the Tutu Foundation slogan, the courage to heal the earth means the land must be given back to the earth. It belongs to her. We are just caretakers. On food question, Ruth laid out so much, because she laid out so many issues. Food is a commons. Food is what flows from the soil to the plants, to us. It flows, nutrition flows into the atmosphere, comes back. When you substitute nutrition with fossil fuels, you get climate change. But if you heal the cycle of nutrition, we can actually solve the climate problem. 50% of the greenhouse gas pollution can literally be put to an end by ending fossil fuel industrial agriculture. We need to shift from industrial agriculture to ecological agriculture. This is the call of all the movements at the Food Summit. And as Ruth said, people want local markets. Globalization was imposed from the top. It is a failed project. It is leaving 5% for the producers and giving the rest of us bad food. Creating food deserts never happened in human history before. Before globalization, there were no food deserts. So we need to localize, and the right to food is everyone's right. How do we create that? First, by reclaiming bioregional distribution. The global supply chains have continued to assume that they will be the controllers of food. None of this will happen with ease. After all, when Gandhi fought Satyagraha on the discriminatory laws against the Asians, he did an 8-year Satyagraha, 8-year struggle to say, we will not obey this law. We refuse to obey this law. When they tried to make seed monopolies in India, we said, we will not accepted because seeds are given to us by creation, evolved by our ancestors. We need to hand it over to future generations. We will not obey the law. When they tried to dump GMO soya oil on us in 98, we did a civil disobedience. We will not obey the law. Our indigenous oils came back. So this is the moment to continue the anti-apartheid legacy of not obeying brutal law. As Mandela said so clearly, like slavery and apartheid, poverty, and I would add hunger, is not a natural phenomenon. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. I think again and again, gardens came up. You know, we've had a movement called Gardens of Hope when widows of GMO crops, you know, suicide, was so in despair. I said, let's start Gardens of Hope. So we started Gardens of Hope with the widows of Monsanto suicides. Those Gardens of Hope have spread. And during the COVID, this is what saw people through. Their own gardens, which became not just sources of food, because they started to remember, but we used to have this herb for immunity. And they started to grow all the old herbs that their grandmothers knew. It became the pharmacy along with the pantry. And we have a very, very beautiful, you know, our national anthem, where Tagore said people came from around the world and became part of one unity in diversity, one humanity. And in the national anthem, Tagore wrote a para. And I want to end with this, that we have to overcome food apartheid, because every minute 11 people are dying for hunger. And that is not acceptable on an earth where there's abundance. It's not acceptable where the empty hands needing work, and the employment now needs to be linked to healing the earth. Courageous healing is earth care as the biggest employment opportunity by bringing seed and food and land back in the commons and water back in the commons. So we need to plant Gardens of Hope everywhere, not as an empty slogan, but as a realistic solution to climate change, to extinction, to hunger, to disease. And we need to weave garlands of love, because the powerful will use every moment of a crisis to divide and rule. They did it with us in 1857. You know, after we got rid of the East India Company, the British said, we'll have to divide the Muslims and the Hindus. And they sowed the seeds of division. They will do it again and again, because they know if we are united in diversity, they stand no chance, because we will weave garlands of love. But we will, in spite of their attempts, because we are one humanity on one planet. And thank you to the Tutu Foundation.
Vandana, thank you very, very much. You know, anything man-made can be unmade and overcome. You've spoken about the opportunity to upend the seeds of division that have been planted and reap something differently. And if we did that, maybe, just maybe, we'd unlock our courage to heal. And maybe with that, it's just fitting for us to call on Piyushi, who started us off with her invitation into the space, and ask her to maybe share just some brief reflections on the conversation that we've had thus far, and then we'll close it off. But just to thank you, Busisiwe, to thank you, Vandana, to thank you, Ruth, for an excellent, provocative, robust conversation that you've had with us over the last almost 90 minutes. Piyushi, over to you. Just to kindly unmute, please, Piyushi.
Thank you, Nazipa. Well, what a rich, textured conversation. I mean, it's been uplifting, and to end on that note of hope, as Vandana has done, you know, the Gardens of Hope is so important for us, where the difference, we can see the difference. We can see the difference. I'll just make two comments, Nazipa. You know, this issue of, and you pushed us, but I don't think we've addressed it, and I'll come to that in a minute. It was said, while 40% of households were going without food, agricultural output was 15% higher than the year before, and retail stores were making huge profits, thereby benefiting hugely during a pandemic. Now, we know that our system, you know, as Ruth called it, liberal, we know the capital intensive, the capitalist system we have at the moment, that is reflected also in the wealth of the wealthy, you know, during the pandemic. This is a pattern. And, you know, it really links to the very important issue of actually having these courageous conversations with those the next level. You mentioned it as actors. This conversation needs to happen with the corporates, with the firms, etc. That kind of nexus of policy implementation, actual lessons from practices and good models. I think that is probably the next, courageous conversation that needs to happen. And I'm sure Ruth has been involved in it, Busiva has been involved in it, and Vandana has been also involved in that. So, because otherwise, it's always be viewed as alternatives, or the alternative group. We need to mainstream this in many ways by way of new paradigms, by way of new models, and new forms of engagement. And I won't say more than that, except that we will reflect on all of this. And I want to end with an observation that I'm sitting here in this building. This is a colonial building, and this is a building which, by the way, how apt is this, is called the Old Granary. And it's called the Old Granary because it actually stored grain for the West. The road that we're on was a sea. This is reclaimed land. This building we're in has the symbols of Neptune and Britannia at the top. And within this building, the Tutu Foundation is changing the discourse, or certainly providing a platform for issues which need to be discussed boldly. It used to be a customs house. It used to be a wayward prison. It used to have many purposes for the colonial powers, but it was an old granary. So on that note, I think that the old granary concept must become the new granary of hope and new conversations. So I'll end on that note. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. It's really been such a pleasure to engage with you individually and collectively. And thank you, Nazipa, for really, really making this conversation so robust and vital and dynamic. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. All the best.